Wendy could sense her sister's unease, so she and Nightingale called everyone to their room and gathered in a circle around the bed. They chatted together to ease everyone's emotions. Nightingale revealed Roland's theories: if the witches used their abilities regularly and regularly utilized their magic, they could bid farewell to the agony caused by the demonic tortures. Seeing some of the girls were skeptical, Nightingale then explained that both Manhwa and Anna had proved this theory. As Awakening Day approaches, as long as everyone uses up all of their magic, it will hardly cause any harm to the body. Wendy stood up, facing her sisters. She claimed that during the days when they were being hunted by the church, they had to hide carefully in the corners of the towns and couldn't use their abilities. As Leaf tried to shake off the chilling memory of the demonic torture she had endured, she was lucky that it was short. Must have been because she had been constantly using her abilities to protect herself from the fidging cold. She wrapped her arms around her body and covered her mouth, trying to dispel the shivers that ran down her spine. Wendy, sensing Leaf's unease, reached out and held her hand, offering comfort and warmth. Wendy reassured her. As long as we can be ourselves and use our abilities freely without being seen as demons, any place can be a holy mountain. Echo, the most unfortunate witch in the group, couldn't fathom why Prince Roland was sheltering them. Lily scowled with contempt and suggested that Roland was just like any other noble who wanted to purchase Echo for. She trailed off and said dismissively, "In the end, he's just a man." Upon hearing Lily's remark, Nightingale was displeased and demanded that Lily refrains from speaking such nonsense. She explained that Roland was different from any other noble and that everyone would understand after living under his protection for some time. Wendy, with her always gentle smile, agreed with Nightingale. It was very late during the night, and Wendy advised everyone to go back to their room and get some sleep. She reillustrated that His Highness had said that he wants all the witches in the territory to be able to live a normal and happy life. She giggled and said, His Highness will probably be asked them to start with filling out a contract first. As Wendy had surmised, the following morning, the maids summoned the witches downstairs for breakfast, and Prince Roland greeted them with exquisitely crafted parchment paper. Roland instructed the witches to practice and hone their abilities in accordance with their designated plans. Mysterious Moon expressed fear that she might lose control of her powers, recounting a near accident where she nearly struck Lily with a metal pan. Roland reassured her that everyone in the household would provide the necessary assistance. Before dismissing the group, Roland summoned Leaf, Soroya, and Skrull to his side. In Prince Roland's office, he pressed the survivors for details about the demonic beast that had led to the death of their mentor Hakura and left only 7 of them alive. The girls had been plagued by terrible nightmares about the encounter. Leaf clenched her fist tightly and trembled as she spoke, correcting Roland's assumption that they had encountered a demonic beast. She revealed that they had faced demons from the gates of hell, towering creatures capable of controlling demonic beasts and wielding potent magical abilities. She hesitated for a moment, then said, "Just like us." Roland turned to Soroya and handed her a parchment, requesting that she illustrate the demon's appearance. Though visibly frightened, Soroya closed her eyes and accepted the paper before walking over to the nearby table. As she began to use her powers, the goose feather pen, which had been faintly visible, appeared in her hand. The tip of the pen glowed with a rainbow light as it flew out of her hand, moving rapidly across the paper. A vivid image gradually emerged on the paper, yet Soroya never opened her eyes. Roland approached the table and saw the incredibly lifelike image on the paper. No, he corrected himself, this wasn't a painting, but a real-time recording of the scene. Her power was like a camera, reproducing the massacre that had taken place in the wilderness from a first-person perspective. When the painting was finished, Soroya's forehead was covered in sweat. It was clear that this memory was like a nightmare to her. Everyone rushed to support her and check her well-being. Leaf pointed her finger to the painting, stating the 2 demons and their abilities. The one with the spear could throw spears faster than crossbow arrows, and the one in the back could summon lightning attacks and had powerful strength. She revealed that the tube underneath the helmet are a weak spot. Hakura's snake bite the tube and both of them perished together. Leaf used the same method and killed the other one with a crossbow. There seemed to be some red gas stored in their pipes, and they only died when the gas leaked out. Roland took a closer look at the painting. This thing looked like an oxygen tank. Roland was at a loss. He wasn't sure if these were aliens, but looking at the patched leather pipes and clothes made of animal skins, they didn't seem much advanced in technology. Leaf then added that there was a floating city, but they could never get close to it, almost as if it was a mirage. Roland then requested Soraya to draw it out. Roland carefully examined the picture, but the blurry image didn't reveal much information. If the city was indeed a mirage, then it at least meant that its true form was located somewhere in the savage lands. The blood mist that enveloped the city and the sky was the gas that the devils breathed. This explanation was much more plausible than the idea of aliens. Roland turned to Scroll and posed his final question, inquiring about the ancient book that Hakura had discovered. He asked if Scroll had any knowledge of it. Scroll replied that no one was permitted to read the book, but she had managed to sneak a peek. The text within was both incomprehensible and remarkable. Roland requested that Scroll record everything she remembered from her glimpse of the book. Scroll used her ability. A book with gilded edges materialized in midair, its covers opening to reveal pages that fluttered before settling with a resounding thud in her hands. Scroll handed over the book and hoped that Roland is the only person who will read it, as she does not want her sisters to end up like Hakura. After the witches had departed from the office, Nightingale appeared silently beside the armchair. As was her custom, she lifted her robe and propped her feet up on the low table before beginning to munch on some dried fish, clearly having no interest in the book. Just like Scroll said, most of the content was difficult to comprehend, with a style of writing and grammar that did not make any sense. It mentioned a blood-red moon and a massive stone door, but there was no reference to the Holy Mountain. To sum it up, Roland recognized each character, but couldn't make sense of them when strung together. Roland skipped over the lengthy passages and flipped to the back of the book. There was only content on the first few pages, with the rest of the pages completely blank. Starting from the final page, the handwriting suddenly changed, becoming sloppy and rushed, as if jotted down in haste. However, the content was clear and concise. The revelation jolted Roland from his seat, as his expression turned horrified and confused. The first line of text is written: "We have failed, mortals cannot defeat demons." Roland had a million questions as he strode through the text. The gods' punishment stone was powerless to stop their attacks. With their unmatched monstrous strength, they were formidable enemies even without using magic. The holy city of Takara has fallen, and we are scattered and fleeing. We crossed mountains and rivers, trying to get as far away from the gates of hell as possible, but where can we flee to next? But that's not something I need to worry about anymore, Natalia. The devil's power is corrupting me, and no medicine is working. I'm writing this down because I have something to ask of you. Akali's Divine Punishment Army experiment is coming to an end, and it's been quite successful. Even ordinary warriors can hold their own against the devils. But she forgot that even if the Divine Punishment Army wins, it won't be a victory for us. Go stop her. Only you can do it. As Roland finished reading the passage, he closed his eyes and pondered over it, trying to put himself in Hakura's perspective. Assuming she didn't know about the existence of demons, if the word demons is replaced with witch in this passage, it would be easy for her to imagine that the church army was retreating under the attack of witches. Considering the widely spread rumors that witches are the minions of the devil and that their magic comes from the gate of hell, Hakura is likely to believe that the church wants to conceal the truth, that the so-called gate of hell is the entrance to the holy mountain, and for hundreds of years, the witches have continued to go to the holy mountain and obtain eternal life there. Therefore, the number of witches is increasing while the number of church warriors is decreasing. After minutes of rendering, however, this did not diminish his doubts. Instead, it made the unknown questions more complex. He questioned when the church fought the demons, where exactly is Takara, and what is Divine Punishment Army? He scratched his head. The previous fourth prince had a small pea-sized brain, thus, Roland had no knowledge about anything. Roland turned his head and asked Nightingale if she knew where Hakura obtained this book. Nightingale wasn't one of the earliest members, but she said that Wendy had once told her that the association was created by a few witches met in Haifeng County. Among them were Wendy, Scroll, and Hakura, and not far from their meeting place, they found an underground relic. Hakura was the only person who went down to explore, and she claimed that she found the book inside. Roland knew Haifeng County was way up in the east, thus he had to cease the investigation and focus on the development of his territory. Due to the increase of witches, Roland thought it a good time to recreate a new organization for the witches. In his vision, the organization did not require any manifesto or principles. It was created for the purpose of efficiently managing witches and allowing them to use their abilities reasonably. The regulations of the organization were kept as simple as possible, consisting of only 2 rules: the use of abilities must not violate territorial laws, and the use of abilities must not be used to evade legal punishment. As for the name of the organization, Roland had already thought of it. This new collective would be called the Witch Alliance. In the Changgu stronghold, Petrov is attending a banquet to celebrate someone's birthday. All of the guests were wealthy and famous nobles in the Changji stronghold. Suddenly, someone hooked their arm around his neck from behind. It was no other than Ron, the second son of the family who held the banquet and also a good friend of Petrov. Ron complimented Petrov on being assigned ambassador by the Duke. He was assigned to join the guard to defend the new holy city, but he ended up catching a really bad cold, spent a week in a neighboring cold wind ridge. Not bad, you've improved a bit since last time. At least you've saved the guards some trouble, Petrov jokingly said. You're wrong this time. Ron suddenly chuckled mysteriously. Then switched to a serious expression. If I hadn't been lying on the cold wind ridge for a week, I would probably have been lying on the cold walls of the holy city forever. Petrov was shocked to hear this and asked why it was that. Ron leaned closer and whispered in a low voice, saying that the new holy city almost fell. The demonic beasts charged so far into the inner city. The holy city was saved by a secret army from the church, but the other 4 kingdoms suffered heavy losses. Barely anyone made it back alive. As Petrov contemplated, he couldn't help but feel suspicious of the situation. He knew that Cold Wind Ridge border guards were mainly defending against the church's judgment army, and now with the leaders and soldiers of the 4 great kingdoms buried together, there seemed to be a hint of conspiracy. Ron then switched his tone, and with a quirky smile, he asked if Petrov happened to notice the handkerchief in the invitation. Petrov thought it was a prank from Ron. Ron laughed and tapped him on the shoulder. He said that the handkerchief was sewed by her sister, who was turning 16 after today. Ron had the clear intention of helping out his best friend. After listening to the conversation, Ron's sister blushed heavily. Suddenly, a fierce debate broke out on one side of the hall, drawing everyone's gaze toward it. Petrov walked toward the table. One of the men stood up and bowed, explaining that they are talking about the lord from the border town, who confiscated the assets of the nobles from the Changji stronghold. The other man stood up explaining that his friend, Cornelius, had his property demolished in the border town without any compensation and even claimed desertion charges against him. As Petrov pondered, the image of the young prince flashed in his mind. Despite the widespread rumors tarnishing the prince's reputation, Petrov knew that the young prince was not an ordinary individual. The charges were used as an excuse to justify his punishment. The prince had never intended to reason with these people. Seems like the prince wants to cut all ties with the Changji stronghold. The other nobles were furious, asking for Ron and Petrov to bring them justice. Ron let out a smile and informed everyone that Duke Ryan had already had his eyes on the prince, who had recently ordered a formation of a coalition, and Ron himself will represent his family and join the coalition. The crowd roared in excitement. Petrov frowned his brows. Petrov was taken aback to learn that his friend was also gearing up for battle. He whispered in Ron's ears, telling him to not attend, warning that Roland is a prince. Ron sneered and claimed that just a useless and ignorant prince. Ron laughed and said, "The prince will probably piss his pants just seeing the coalition." Telling Petrov to not worry about him, then turned around to talk with the other nobles. Petrov parted his lips but refrained from uttering a word. He was worried about his friend's safety. Even himself were skeptical about Roland being able to beat the coalition led by the famous Duke Ryan, but he had a bad feeling about this. Later in the night, Petrov returned to his home. His father asked him to gather a summary of their territory's production, population, and income, as his family will also be preparing for the battle and needed to send knights and mercenaries to fight the border town. Petrov hesitated and quietly questioned, how many did they need to send, sensing the odd behavior from his son. He opened a letter that was sitting on the table next to him. requiring them to provide at least 25 knights, accompanied by their appropriate retinue and horses. 40 mercenaries are required, fully equipped with weapons, and at least 100 freemen and serfs are armed with basic weaponry. Petrov pled to his father to avoid going to the battlefield. He hesitated for a moment before speaking up.
What the problem, son?
The father asked. Petrov said he was concerned about his father's safety. His father burst out laughing, saying how dangerous could it be when an elephant stepped on some ants. The prince only had a few knights and less than 50 guards, and the coalition has 10 times the size. Petrov then talked about the mud wall that Prince Roland built, which everyone expected to crumble down after a rainfall, and how they were able to defend the border town just with miners and survive the month of the demons.
Enough!
His father's hand slammed down on the table, his expression one of disappointment. He didn't mind his son's focus on business and wealth accumulation over knighthood in battle, but he was extremely displeased with his son's cowardice. Standing up, he walked over to the wall decorated with portraits of their ancestors. They all stood their ground in this land filled with beasts, refugees, and bandits thanks to their swords, bows, and arrows. Petrov clenched his fist tightly, shaking uncontrollably. He really wanted to tell his father that he was wrong. Looking at his father, who was only in his 40s but bald, fat, and oily, with a double chin and a loose belt, Petrov wondered how he could compare himself to their ancestors with their robust and muscular figures. His father will most likely to picked up by the prince's chopsticks and eaten alive. Petrov shook his head, knowing that he can't convince his father today. On a bright and sunny afternoon, Roland fulfilled the promise and ennobled Tigu Pine as a viscount. Offering him a territory, turned out, Mr. Pine didn't care much. He just wants to spend his time with his daughter and hunting. Roland also conferred Brian as a knight. Brian chose to join the First Army, and Roland had a great blueprint for land development. Soon, Soraya entered the room. Roland waved his hand and told Soraya to come closer. Roland questioned how was Soraya feeling about her work in the municipal hall. Soraya said everything was well. Turned out, Roland built a small room in the municipal hall, where he asked the residents from the border town to line up in front of the room. With the help of Soraya's ability, they were able to store the townspeople's information, with their basic information also a photograph of them. Roland called Soraya over today to ask her to create some entertainment props. Roland asked Soraya to draw a soldier holding a heavy crossbow on this sheet of paper. Then told her to add some circles and lines, then add a number and a shape in the circles. Thus, the first card of the new card game Gwent is created. After finishing all the cards, Soraya and Roland had fun playing a few rounds, but Soraya kept losing. Roland smiled and told Soraya to play with her sisters and introduce the game to them. Just then, a piece of cheerful and melodious music came from outside the window. It was no other than Echo, who had now mastered the song that Roland taught her. In the other room, Scroll knocked on the door, and Anna was sitting at the table by the window, flipping through thick books. The sunlight streamed in through the window, casting a long shadow on the woman. Her soft cheeks and neck were almost blindingly white in the light, and the linen-colored hair covering her shoulders was almost dyed a light gold. Scroll smiled and asked, "Did Anna check out the new card game?" Anna smiled and said she wanted to read more books and complimented Echo's voice. Scroll pulled out the chair and sat facing Anna. Echo had told Scroll that out of all of the sisters, she envies Anna's ability the most. Scroll then talked about Echo's past. Echo came from the southern continent. The Witch Association saved her from a slave merchant. She was sold for a high price and suffered a lot. She had always wanted a strong ability. Maybe it could have changed her fate. Scroll then lightly patted Anna's head, saying that it was because of Anna and His Highness's encounter that changed the fate of everyone here. Scroll approached Anna and noticed that her hair had grown quite long. She offered to cut it for her, as she was a skilled hairdresser and had already cut the hair of most of the girls in the association. She quickly returned with a bundle of cloth in her hand and revealed her hair-cutting tools, which she had saved from her previous job as a hairdresser in a tavern before joining the association. Scroll had saved up all the bronze she earned from cutting hair and used some for food, but gave most of it to an old captain with one leg. The old captain taught her how to read, until he died of old age. All of the folk stories that Anna read recently were from the tavern. Anna asked if the book she got from Scroll had a lot of stories, but it always ended with a similar ending. Anna hesitated and asked, will the prince always marry the princess as his wife? Scroll paused briefly. The storybook in question was not a true literary work, but rather a collection of folk tales that she had heard from sailors during her many years in the tavern. Scroll had intentionally carefully selected and edited the stories, omitting those with a happy ending or where the prince did not end up with the princess, and compiled them into a single volume, which now appeared before Anna as a magical source of reading material. Scroll then said, in some cases, sometime the prince will also marry a duke or famous noble's daughter. After speaking, Scroll sighed inwardly. Wendy had mentioned Nightingale's feelings to her before. Unlike the mature and calm Nightingale, she was more concerned about Anna getting too close to the prince. Anyone could see how important she was to His Highness. Whenever Anna was present, Roland's gaze would always be more focused on her. Unfortunately, Roland was the fourth prince of Grey Castle, the future king whom the witches supported. Scroll couldn't remind the prince, so it had to come up with a way to hint to Anna. It didn't want to create a rift between the two, nor did it want to see a tragic outcome with no resolution. Anna pondered, why will this happen? What if the prince doesn't like princesses or noble daughters? Scroll was not expecting this question, but she then told Anna that the prince is forced to marry them, because the prince may become a king in the future, in order to maintain stability among the powerful nobles on the far borders of the kingdom, and for political stability, the most crucial factor was that the king must have an heir. There was a silence between the two. Shortly after, the haircut was completed, and Scroll offered Anna a new book. Then walked out of the room. Anna thanked Scroll. And before she left, Anna said, Roland is not like the prince in the stories. Anna's voice was very certain, and not like she was trying to convince herself. He only does what he wants to do, and nothing else matters. Scroll turned around and looked puzzled. Anna let out a brilliant smile and said, if he were such a prince, he wouldn't have saved me. Oh my god, this is too cute and too sweet. Stay tuned for the next video. We are getting real close to the actions. Following his supper, Roland proceeded back to his office, where he continued to transcribe his foundational mathematical knowledge from his mind onto the paper. Roland proceeded to show Scroll the Pythagorean theorem. Whenever Roland finished writing on a sheet of paper, he would allow Scroll to scan through it. Anything that she looked at would be permanently saved in her memory. Unfortunately, Scroll's abilities were limited to memorization only, and she couldn't understand the basic high school level mathematical concepts on her own. Therefore, in his free time, Roland had to explain them to her. Unlike Scroll, Roland didn't have a photographic memory, and in fact, his memory would gradually weaken with time. Due to his engineering background, he often used subjects such as mathematics and physics, but other subjects like history, geography, biology, and chemistry had likely deteriorated to a rudimentary level. Regardless of whether or not it was needed, writing down the contents that he had not yet forgotten earlier could help him retain more knowledge. As Roland transcribed, he pondered what magic in this world truly was. The utilization of magic enabled all witches to manifest an array of inconceivable abilities. In the later half of his life, Einstein aspired to integrate the four fundamental forces of the universe into a single theoretical framework, known as the theory of everything. In a sense, what he did was search for the origin. Roland wondered, could there be a universal principle that applies to any universe? Regardless, Roland could only ponder about it, since with the current level of technology, he couldn't possibly analyze such a force. Therefore, his primary task was to advance industry and technology and promote the progress of civilization. Perhaps one day, he could truly understand this power. Your Highness? Scroll spoke up upon seeing the prince lost in thought and couldn't help but ask. Roland snapped out of his reverie and coughed twice, glancing at the almost burnt-out candle. Let's call it a day here. As she lowered her head to bow and leave, she unconsciously slowed her pace. Turned around, hesitated for a moment before asking a question. He guessed that her question was probably something along the lines of, why are you willing to shelter us? Aren't you afraid of the threat from the church? Nightingale and Wendy had asked him many times before. Is it possible for you to marry a witch? Scroll respectfully asked. Roland almost spat out the water he had in his mouth after hearing the question. Marriage to a witch? Roland's mind immediately conjured up the image of Anna, who had left a deep impression on him since their meeting in the cell. Her lake blue eyes had captivated him. Witches were women who possessed exceptional abilities, awakened from ordinary humans. They excelled in both appearance and physique, for sure making them the center of attention in modern society back on Earth. So why hesitate? He looked towards Scroll and replied with a smile. Why not? Rubbing her sore shoulders, Wendy returned to her room. After nearly a month of training, her wind-controlling abilities had greatly improved. When Wendy arrived, Nightingale had already finished bathing and was sitting on the bed in her pajamas, waiting for her. However, what surprised Wendy was the uncontrollable smile on Nightingale's face. Did something good happen, or maybe you joined the other for a game of Gwent? Wendy couldn't help but ask, but Nightingale shook her head and didn't say anything, just smiling a little deeper. Nightingale was concealed in the room when Scroll posed the question, her presence unbeknownst to all. As Roland began to speak, she listened intently, her heart racing with a mixture of astonishment and relief. Wendy smiled, saying that Nightingale must have gotten a really great card. 2 weeks had passed since the month of the demons. After shedding its pure white veil, the trees on both sides of the river have sprouted fresh leaves and are now lush with greenery. The land outside the eastern edge of the town, which was once baked by Anna's scorching heat, has now been temporarily designated by His Highness as the training ground for the 1st Border Town Army. The majority of soldiers in the 1st Army are now armed with flintlocks, which Roland has equipped with bayonets. Axe and Carter oversee the training sessions, where soldiers practice thrusting and stabbing with their new weapons. Roland arrived to inspect the training session, accompanied by Echo. He asked Carter to gather all the soldiers together, as he had an announcement to make. Seconds later.
Hail, Your Highness!
The soldiers exclaimed in unison, raising their hands to their foreheads. Roland nodded his head and walked over to the crowd, about to say something when a burly man suddenly broke out from the ranks. Carter furrowed his brows and stepped forward, placing his hand on his sword hilt to shield the prince behind him. Nightingale also appeared beside Roland, protecting him. The burly man who rushed out was none other than Axe. He did not run towards the prince, but instead knelt straight down in front of the woman. His whole body prostrated on the ground, head deeply buried between his arms. "My chieftain!" he called out. The training was forced to come to a halt, and everyone followed Roland back to his office. The story itself was not complicated. Echo was originally a member of the Proud Sand clan from the Iron Sand City. Her real name was Drow Silvermoon, and her father was the chief of the Proud Sand clan. The Sand people were not a unified group, and the population that the Iron Sand City could accommodate was limited. Therefore, every 3 years, each clan had to conduct a sacred battle in the Burning Land. Only the 6 winning clans could obtain the right to live in the city. Despite their proud and valiant efforts in battle, the Sand tribe was defeated through insidious means, leading to the tragic loss of their chieftain and Echo's brother. Adding to the tribe's devastation. After the defeat, due to her outstanding appearance, Echo was captured and sold as a slave. Axe, who was of mixed blood, faced discrimination from other Sand people who did not consider him a true Magan. Despite this, he did his best to protect Echo. Unfortunately, during one attempt to save her, he was struck on the back of the head and rendered unconscious. After Echo was sold as a top-quality slave to a trader in Bluewater Harbor, Axe spent years traveling across the southern region and visiting numerous slave markets in search of her. Despite his efforts, he was unable to gather any information about her whereabouts. Axe knelt down, swore on his life to serve Roland, and apologized for his earlier outburst. Roland told him to stand up. Roland paused for a moment and then continued, telling Echo and Axe that helping them to get revenge is not out of the question. Axe widened his eyes in disbelief. Echo didn't react much, indicating that she didn't hold much hope for returning to Iron Sand City. Roland pondered in his mind. When Axe described the southernmost region, he had heard some very interesting things. The land was hot and dry, with a strange and varied environment. In particular, there was a kind of orange flame that erupted from underground and could burn for decades without going out. Near the flames, there were often huge ground fissures with black underworld rivers flowing endlessly at the bottom. Sounds familiar? Isn't that oil? And it's even flowing on the surface. The importance of this black liquid for industry goes without saying. Half of the modern wars are fought over it. Fluctuations in oil prices can affect the rise and fall of countries. And it can even change the world order. But the border town is too far from the Iron Sand City. Roland told Axe that he will seek justice for them when he ascends to the throne. Axe's actions today violated the first military rule. He was put into solitary confinement for 2 days. Roland wanted him to take this time to reflect on his behavior. A group of soldiers waited on the field, and one of the younger soldiers walked up to Brian, who was now a squad leader, and asked if His Highness would punish Axe for his earlier outburst. Shortly afterward, Roland, Carter, and Echo returned to the training field. Carter had already ordered everyone to form up in their assigned groups and stand in formation. Roland announced, stepping forward to address them. Roland informed that the woman standing behind him is a witch, who is a long-lost relative of Axe. Roland also notified the group that Axe was penalized with a 2-day confinement for disrupting the formation and violating military discipline. Roland emphasized again that the most important qualities of a soldier are obedience and discipline. Roland introduced Echo's abilities, informing that Echo will now be presenting a marching song, then ordered the men to march according to the beat, keep the formation on the same line. As everyone questioned what exactly is a marching song, Roland pointed toward Echo and made it very clear that Echo is the banner flag of the First Army and the soul of the Flintlock Squad. Everyone must do everything possible to protect her. As the unfamiliar melody reverberated through the chamber, all of the men instantly grasped His Highness's intention. The rhythmical beat of the drums compelled them to move their feet, and the lively tune stirred their thirst for battle. This is what's known as a marching song, also known as a war song. That motivates and inspires soldiers to keep moving forward on the battlefield. Suddenly, in the midst of the night, a group of soldiers stood guard at the castle gate when a torrent of arrows rained down upon them. Before they could even react, the arrows pierced through their bodies, leaving them looking like porcupines. Timothy, the new king, turned around and saw the flagpoles being raised, the gray flags unfolding in the wind. Timothy finally arrived at the Eagle's Nest City. His army was immensely large, consisting primarily of his personal bodyguards, the royal knights, and the troops of Duke Francherat from the eastern province. Altogether, the 3 groups totaled up to 6,000 people, with a staggering 1,000 well-trained and well-equipped knights. Timothy had launched a surprise attack on his sister's army. The people on the city wall stood scattered and loosely, indicating that they were not fully prepared for defending the city. With a relaxed tone, Timothy handed the binoculars to Duke Fran and remarked, "Looks like she wants to run." The Duke agreed with Timothy and complimented Timothy's brilliant tactic to attack during the night. Satisfied, Timothy gazed upon the easily captured Eagle's Nest City, realizing that everything had gone exactly as he had planned, if not better. Timothy ordered his army to charge. The army behind him surged forward, and several groups of soldiers emerged from the formation. Led by a handful of knights, they strode confidently toward Eagle's Nest City. Suddenly, in the distance, a banner was raised amidst the crowd. The green silk flag fluttered in the wind, bearing the emblem of a sailboat and a crown. Timothy raised his binoculars. He scanned the enemy's formation. There, he spotted a blurred figure of a woman standing on a makeshift platform held by multiple men underneath. She held her hands aloft, seemingly shouting something at the top of her lungs. Meanwhile, to Duke Fran's surprise, the people who had originally stood guard on the city walls were nowhere to be seen. The entire perimeter was now unguarded and devoid of any activity. He could sense something was wrong. As the Duke passed through the city gates, he caught a whiff of a pungent odor. Little did he know, a black liquid was underneath their feet. The Duke headed toward the main castle. After touring the main castle, Fran noticed that something was odd. The castle is too empty, he thought to himself, not just of coins, but the entire basement is devoid of any cloth or grain stores. The entire castle has been stripped bare. Suddenly, thick black smoke began to rise from the northern gate. One of the knights reported that the fire cannot be put out. It not only couldn't be extinguished by water, but it also seemed to flow along the water. A female knight ran towards them from the direction of the city center, not even waiting to stop his horse before jumping off its back, informing that the fire have now reached the inner city. The Duke then shouted loudly, telling his men to not panic, claiming that this was the power of the witches. As long as everyone wears the god punishment stone, the fire will not hurt them. He then hopped on his horse and ordered his man to charge with him. Revised, as they approached the city walls, they were met with a fierce wall of flames that blocked their path. Without hesitation, he ordered his man to jump over the flame, as the god's punishment stone will protect them. The Duke leaped over the fire and turned to see if his knights had followed, but to his dismay, none of them made it through. The Duke quickly realized that this was no witchcraft but a deadly trap. His horse had suffered severe burns, and he struggled to pull himself out of the danger zone. As the city burned to ashes, the Duke's soldiers fell one by one, leaving no survivors. Exhausted and battered, the Duke knelt to the ground, only to be confronted by a towering figure wielding a one-handed axe. The Duke recognized him as a sand person. With one swift swish, he felt his head leaving his body. The royal knights were like a silver blade, cutting into the rear of Garcia's army. The crowd suddenly became chaotic, and many people stumbled and were trampled to death by the galloping horses while trying to flee. Occasionally, someone drew their weapon to resist, but they were skillfully pierced by the spear of the knights. Garcia sat on her chair, surveying the entire battlefield. With a pointed finger, she ordered the rest of her army to charge. As Timothy's knights were about to charge into the enemy lines, large numbers of men and horses suddenly appeared on the eastern and western horizons. They emitted strange cries and galloped madly toward the center of the battlefield. They were tall and strong figures, with basic weaponry. There was no doubt that they were the Sand People. Seeing the heavy casualties, he turned around and shouted loudly, "Blow the horn, call the knights back." But it was too late. Half an hour later, there were fewer and fewer knights still fighting. When the Sand People turned their attention to the position where Timothy was standing, he gritted his teeth and issued the order to retreat. The group began to move north, and compared to the large army that arrived earlier, only 300 people remained by the new king's side. Back in the border town, Roland had already received intel about Duke Ryan and the Changji stronghold. He is confident that his army will be able to defeat the coalition, and he wondered if he should move to the Changji stronghold after his victory. Then he thought about the power structure is complex and intertwined. With a large number of nobles, and the territories are managed according to the feudal system. The border town had much more freedom, but he knew he could move the gold, resources, craftsmen, and laborers from the Changji stronghold to the border town. At that moment, a yellow figure flew in through the window and landed straight toward Roland's stomach. It was lightning, informing Roland that they are here. The mighty coalition marched slowly on the road toward the border town. At the forefront of the procession was the knight formed by the 6 major families of the stronghold. Duke Ryan looked satisfied as he gazed at this sharp and powerful force. There was no doubt that with their strength, no one in the West could stop him. Petrov's father remembered Petrov's warning and wanted to be more cautious since the border town managed to defend against the demonic beasts. Erlmus ridiculed Roland and his army. Duke Ryan agreed with Erlmus's comment and added that Hermes suffered a large-scale attack by the demonic beasts. And the holy city almost fell. He claimed that all of the beasts this year were targeting the holy city. And only a few slipped through toward here. Duke Ryan also knew that Timothy and Garcia had engaged in a fierce battle at the Eagle Nest city in the south, and Timothy had suffered large casualties. And this is his perfect chance to become a king and declare independence in the West. The Duke grinned with satisfaction at the thought. He ordered to send out an envoy to persuade Prince Roland to surrender. Ron, who was responsible for leading the way for the army, rushed back to report that there were soldiers holding weapons not far from them. Duke Ryan raised his binoculars to observe border towns' formation. The troops in the lens appeared very peculiar. They held strange weapons that can only be assumed as wooden sticks and stood in two tightly packed rows. Duke Ryan let out a smirk and ordered his army to charge, as the enemy appeared in the distance. Vainer and the rest of the soldiers, seeing the fully armed knights riding tall horses, dressed in shiny armor, slowly approaching the town. Now, with nearly 100 knights appearing all at once, this sight made them gasp in surprise. Vainer felt his palms sweat again, just like when he first faced the mixed-breed demonic beasts on the city wall. But this time, he was facing his own kind. The coalition army of the Changji stronghold. Vainer took a deep breath, regaining his composure, knowing that nowadays, under the governance of the prince, the border town has been improving day by day, and these changes are visible to everyone. Vainer assured his men that the coalition was nothing to be afraid of. Under the guidance of His Highness, they had already triumphed over demonic beasts, and these knights were no match for their bravery. The morale of their troops soared as they chanted Roland's name. Behind the border town's defense, on a small mountain, Roland, Carter, and Axe surveyed the battlefield. Just then, Lightning dashed towards the town's defenses, waving her arms and the yellow ribbons in her hands fluttering in the wind. The yellow signal indicated that the enemy had entered the cannon range, prompting everyone to turn their gaze to Roland. Taking a deep breath, Roland shouted, "Fire!" The first round of cannonballs made a loud sound but missed their target. Duke Ryan then ordered his men to charge. But before the coalition could react, the second round of shelling began. A cannonball soared through the sky, precisely landing in a squad of soldiers, taking them out in one fell swoop. The vulnerability and fragility of the human body were exposed under the heat of the weapons. Once grazed by an iron ball, it would result in an irreparable injury. Knights hit directly were not only dismembered but also sprayed with a cloud of blood. Only when the cannonballs hit the ground and ricocheted for the second time could one faintly see a blurry black specter ravaging the lives of its companions in the crowd. The Duke ordered his men to sound the horn of attack. The long-range weapons would be rendered useless if engaged in close combat. The cannon crew sprang into action, clearing the barrels and reloading ammunition, as well as relocating the cannons. At that moment, Lightning returned to the defensive line, and in her hand was a ribbon now colored red. A red signal indicated that the enemy had come within 500 meters. As the deafening roar subsided, he barely had time to observe the result of the attack before turning around and shouting at the ammunition delivery personnel, "Send up the shotgun shells." As the iron barrel flew out of the cannon's muzzle, it ruptured due to the immense pressure differential, and the iron pellets inside scattered like raindrops toward the enemy. The knights who were fortunate enough not to be covered by the barrage finally approached the charging distance. They had only one thought in their minds: to break through this thin defense line and slaughter the cowards who could only hide behind the line and operate evil weapons. The remaining knights lowered their bodies and urged their horses to the highest speed. However, these 150 meters seemed to be an unreachable distance. The last round of close-range shotgun blasts completely crushed the knights' fighting spirit. Within 100 meters, the hard-to-deform iron pellets could penetrate 2 to 3 people. The cone-shaped area in front of the muzzle became the domain of death, and almost none of the 20 or so knights who charged at the forefront were spared, the only difference being how many pellets hit them. The soldiers collapsed, scattered in fear, had no chance of being saved, turned around, and tried to flee the battlefield. The wave of defeat swept over Duke Ryan's coalition army, and the situation quickly became uncontrollable. The crowd rushed back, and people were trampled to death in the chaos. No one had time to care for others, only regretting why they didn't have 2 more legs. 2 of the nobles, seeing the chaos, requested Duke Ryan to retreat first. Duke Ryan's expression soon changed, as he reached out for his sword and sliced through the soldier who dared to retreat. No matter how much he roared, he could not control his fleeing troops. Helpless, Duke Ryan had no choice but to retreat with the crowd. As the sun gradually sank behind the mountains, Carter gazed at the blood-red sky and the cawing of crows in the distant forest, and he suddenly felt a sense of desolation. The era of knights had come to an end. And the era of Roland had just begun. Duke Ryan still hasn't been able to come to his senses. He couldn't understand how he had been defeated. As nightfall arrived, the Duke chose a spot near the riverbank to set up camp. The scattered knights and mercenaries eventually gathered around the torches, but a large portion of the group remained missing. Carter and Axe lead a group of musketeers closely following Duke Ryan and his defeated army. The witches had played a vital role in this triumph, and as Roland reminisced about his witch army, he couldn't help but feel elated to the point where his mouth started to water. Anna suddenly appeared behind Roland on the ship deck, and he was caught off guard. Roland began to panic, frantically waving his hands around, and insisting that he wasn't doing anything. Anna smiled and handed over her handkerchief. As it so happened, Roland found himself spending the night in the company of witches. As darkness descended, Nightingale nestled to his right, while Anna slumbered peacefully on his left. Despite the cozy company, Roland found it challenging to drift off to sleep. It appears that Roland wasn't the only one struggling to catch some shut-eye that night. In a moment of kindness, he taught Anna a simple trick for falling asleep, counting sheep. Nightingale, on the other hand, watched on as Roland shared his knowledge and then pretended to sleep. However, the morning brought with it some unexpected consequences. Anna, Nightingale, and Roland all awoke with dark circles under their eyes, evidence of a restless night spent counting sheep. It seemed that the trick hadn't worked quite as well as Roland had hoped. Inside the largest tent at the campsite, the 5 noble families had gathered together, their faces etched with worry and fear. All eyes were fixed on Duke Ryan, who appeared equally troubled and pale-faced. The atmosphere in the tent was tense, with a sense of unease hanging heavily in the air. Duke Ryan turned to Ron, who had been at the forefront of the battlefield, and demanded answers. "What the hell happened out there?" he asked, his voice tense and urgent. The other nobles in the tent looked on, their eyes fixed on Ron, waiting for an explanation. It was clear that everyone was shaken by the events that had transpired on the battlefield. Ron remained seated, his face buried in his hands as he spoke. "All I heard was a deafening, continuous rumbling sound," he said, his voice heavy with distress. "And then they fell, one after another, especially after that final blast." Ron shook his head as if struggling to find the words to describe what he had witnessed. "The knight leading the charge seemed to hit an invisible wall," he continued, his voice trembling. "I watched in horror as his body convulsed before his head and limbs were violently torn apart into 5 pieces." As Count Moose raised the possibility of witchcraft, Duke Ryan was quick to dismiss the idea. He pointed out that all of the knights had been equipped with god punishment stones, which were known to render witches powerless. Duke Ryan shared his plan with the other nobles. He proposed that they regroup their troops and return to the Changgu stronghold. From there, they would cut off all supplies going into the border town, effectively starving the town into surrendering. As the nobles discussed their plan, they were interrupted by an unfamiliar melody that filled the air. The sound was coming from a location not far from their tent. Before they could react, a deafening explosion shook the ground beneath their feet, causing the tent to shudder and flap wildly. As Duke Ryan rushed out of the tent, he saw that everyone was running in panic. The ground shook with the force of the explosion, and dirt and blood sprayed through the air. Looking towards the west, he saw a line of militiamen in uniform armor, standing silently outside the camp. "Duke, quickly, we need to leave." One of his guards brought him a horse and yelled urgently. It was then that Duke Ryan snapped out of his daze. He mounted the horse and rode eastward with his guard, but they had barely left the campsite when they came face to face with another identical army. The soldiers wore identical armor and held strange short sticks in their hands. They stood in perfect formation, with identical expressions on their faces. Then, Duke Ryan heard a rhythmic melody coming from the opposite direction. The army of princes' men led by Axe marched towards them with a uniform step. The army came to a sudden stop, as if choreographed with perfect precision, standing before Ryan like an impenetrable barrier. Then, to his horror, He saw them raise their weapons, short wooden sticks that looked innocent enough, until he heard the deafening series of thuds that followed. As the Duke fearlessly approached the wall of soldiers, the pounding sounds reverberated through his body like a thunderous drumbeat. He staggered back, feeling the impact of each blow on his chest and stomach. Suddenly, a paralyzing weakness consumed him, causing his body to convulse and collapse off his horse. Despite his valiant efforts to speak, no words escaped his lips. His throat burned with a thick, sweet, and bloody fluid, leaving him gasping for air. In the end, darkness took him, enveloping him in an eerie silence. After the successful assassination of Duke Ryan, Roland and his men made their way towards the Canggu stronghold. To their surprise, they encountered little resistance and were able to easily take control of the fortress. Now came the most exciting part, the looting process. The group meticulously searched through every nook and cranny of the castle, pillaging everything in their path. As they approached the treasure room, their hearts raced with anticipation. Inside, they found stacks upon stacks of gleaming gold, a treasure trove beyond their wildest dreams. Shortly after, Carter informed Roland that Petrov is requesting to meet him. As Petrov made his way to the castle district in the east, he realized that half an hour had already elapsed. It was then that he came across a group of unfamiliar militia standing in front of the Lord's castle. These soldiers were unlike any he had ever seen before. They were not adorned in polished armor or embellished with cloaks and ribbons. Instead, they held peculiar-looking short sticks with pointed spears affixed to the top. Despite their unorthodox weaponry, their disciplined formation in two neat rows exuded an air of menace and intimidation. Petrov already had planned for the worst. As Petrov entered the hall, he saw the fourth prince seated at the head of the table, scribbling something down. When the prince looked up and saw Petrov, he paused for a moment before breaking into a smile. Roland motioned for Petrov to take a seat, and Petrov breathed a sigh of relief knowing that his father was unharmed, having been one of the first to surrender. Grateful for Roland's mercy, Petrov offered to pay any amount of ransom to secure his father's release. However, Roland shook his head, indicating that he had no interest in gold. "I want livestock and people," he said. Petrov was taken aback by the request. "It's simple," Roland explained, handing Petrov a scroll. "I want masons, carpenters, farmers, and serfs. You can use the values on the scroll to calculate, but the total must be at least 3,000. He smiled slyly. "Oh, and by the way, since your father is the highest-ranking captive we have, his value is also the highest." Petrov couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had expected Roland to demand a hefty ransom, but instead, he was asking for laborers and peasants. Petrov's eyes widened at the sheer amount of livestock and people Roland demanded as ransom. He quickly calculated in his head that the requested value of 3,000 meant he would need to provide either 1,000 cattle or 300 skilled masons to secure his father's release. Petrov, a shrewd noble who was no stranger to the world of trade, was presented with an intriguing problem. He was given a limited number of cows and stonemasons, and tasked with finding the optimal solution to meet a target of 3,000 points while keeping costs to a minimum. The challenge was not an easy one. The various combinations of cows and stonemasons available presented countless possibilities, and finding the best one would require careful analysis and calculation. Roland held up one finger, indicating that he is only willing to give Petrov 1 day to make the calculation, and a week to arrange, since Roland will only be staying here for less than a week. Petrov pondered about the time frame, but suddenly the prince's words shocked him. Did the prince say he is leaving? Petrov's mind started racing. He knew for a fact that Duke Ryan have fallen in battle, and the stronghold now belonged to the prince. Why would he want to leave? Was this magnificent fortress not good enough for him? But no, that wasn't the point. The real issue was, if the prince left, who would manage this grand city? Petrov's mind raced with questions and concerns. He couldn't believe the prince would just abandon his newfound stronghold and all the opportunities it presented. Surely there was more to the story than what was on the surface. And yet, the reality remained: if the prince left, there would be chaos in the stronghold. Petrov couldn't let that happen. He had to find a way to convince the prince to stay, or at the very least, to appoint someone who could manage the city in his absence. Suddenly, a thought sprang to Petrov's mind, one that he knew he couldn't suppress any longer. "Your Highness." Petrov swallowed hard and whispered. "May I ask, does redeeming the Changji stronghold also have a numerical value?" Roland gazed at Petrov with a keen interest and suddenly burst into laughter. "You're the first person to ask me that question in such a way," he said, taking a sip of his drink and speaking in a relaxed tone. Roland is not asking for a ransom, but rather, what he called agency fees. Every month, Roland will be demanding 30% of taxable income from the Changji stronghold, and 1,000 value of resources, and the rest will belong to the agent. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Petrov, and he was determined not to let it slip away. Before Roland allowed Petrov to respond, he asked what Petrov would do to those who opposed him, what his estimate was for monthly tax income, what his plans and measures were for developing trade and commerce, and how he could guarantee a value of 1,000 resources. Petrov racked his brain to answer each question in this series, while the expression on His Highness' face grew increasingly satisfied. Finally, he clapped his hands and said, "Well done, that will be all for today. Once you have determined the ransom amount of 3,000, you may come and redeem the count. Rest assured, I will take good care of him during these days." After the questions, Petrov's brain was fried, and Carter helped him leave the room. Roland looked at Nightingale, who had just appeared beside him. "Well, he's telling the truth for the most part," she shrugged. Roland was surprised to find such talent. He thought all of the nobles only knew how to fight on horses. He found the name of Petrov Helmon on the list and lightly circled it with a quill pen. He leaned back in his chair, and Nightingale came up behind him and voluntarily began to massage his shoulders with her hands. "Your Highness, are you really only staying here for a week?" Nightingale asked. "What's the matter?" Roland closed his eyes and enjoyed the tingling sensation in his shoulders. "Isn't this the largest city in the western region?" She whispered. "Don't you want to stay in this more prosperous place compared to the border town?" Roland's smile widened as he considered the question. He knew the power dynamics at play within the Changgu stronghold were complex, making it difficult for him to effect any major changes. However, that wasn't the real reason he had chosen to focus his efforts elsewhere. As Roland thoughtfully gazed off into the distance, he reflected on the fact that the church had deeply influenced the people of the stronghold, making it difficult for them to accept witches. His vision was to create a haven where witches could freely walk on the streets and live like normal people, and he knew that only the border town could achieve that. With a nod of agreement, Nightingale chimed in. "You've kept your promise, Your Highness." Nightingale suddenly turned her back and patted her chest, as if she is preparing for something. She could feel her heart pounding, and Roland was taken aback by Nightingale's sudden action. He had been so focused on his paperwork that he had not noticed her approach. Before he could react, she had pulled him closer and given him a quick kiss on the lips. Roland felt his face grow warm as Nightingale disappeared into thin air, leaving him alone and stunned in his seat. Roland was about to take a nap when the castle welcomed a special guest, the High Priest Taylor of the Changgu Stronghold Church. Roland instantly lost his drowsiness but still had a light blush on his cheeks from the earlier incident. The High Priest Taylor is a middle-aged man who wears a white and blue ceremonial robe typical of the church. He is around 40 years old, and both his attire and appearance are immaculate. His manner of speaking and behavior resemble those of a courteous and refined nobleman. After Taylor bowed in greeting, Roland invited him to take a seat and instructed his attendant to serve tea. With a smile on his face, Taylor congratulated Roland on becoming the ruler of the western border and appeared unfazed by Duke Ryan's demise, showing little interest in who holds power. In his defense, the church seldom interferes in secular affairs. Roland then got straight to the point and asked about the purpose of Taylor's visit. Taylor had come to both congratulate Roland and offer his cooperation. He had offered to lend a hand in expanding Roland's territory and influence. Roland's expression turned into a frown. "Didn't you just say that the church rarely intervenes in secular disputes?" The high priest replied calmly, rarely intervening doesn't mean never interfering. The ongoing conflict between Garcia and Timothy has made the lives of the southern residents miserable. As long as you can provide your people with stability and peace, the church will recognize you as a worthy and respected ruler. Roland was taken aback for a moment, realizing that Taylor's offer to help expand his territory and influence was a veiled attempt to support his claim to the throne. The high priest seemed to possess a great deal of knowledge about Roland and the border town. He commended Roland's bravery in defending the town and protecting his people. Roland didn't believe the high priest's reasons for offering his help, but at least his words confirmed that the church was keeping a watchful eye on this remote corner of the world, even during the long, isolated winter months when the border town was cut off from the outside world by heavy snow. The high priest took out a box with 2 pills from his pocket, one red and one black. He went on to explain that these were crafted by the church's alchemy workshop. The red pill could temporarily enhance the strength of Roland's subordinates, while the black pill could increase their endurance to pain, cold, and heat several times over. Before the priest left, he said that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The pills are just the beginning, and the church can offer much more help. Nightingale wasn't able to use her ability to spot whether the priest was lying since the priest was wearing a god punishment stone, but when Nightingale took a closer look at the 2 pills are sort of like a god punishment stone. The cavity wasn't circular, but rather like a series of black threads flowing through it, but it doesn't resemble the effect of a god punishment stone. Roland carefully wrapped the pills in a piece of paper and tucked them into his pocket. Roland had a strong hunch that the church had ulterior motives. On the surface, it appeared that they sought to expand their reach by garnering more followers and creating a stable country. However, something felt off. Instead of throwing their weight behind Timothy or Garcia, who was actively striving to unify the country, the church chose to support Roland, particularly after Garcia's decisive victory. The church's motives seemed self-serving, and while accepting their support may appear tempting, it could potentially worsen the already tumultuous conflict between the 2 kings of Grey Castle. The aftermath of such a scenario would be catastrophic: a rapid decline in population, the loss of wealth, and the flames of war engulfing the entire nation. The dream of unification would be delayed, perhaps indefinitely. It begs the question, what could the church possibly gain from such a destructive outcome? Rather than expanding their influence, they would likely face the destruction of their precious churches and a decline in their followers. It seemed a short-sighted and reckless decision. Roland had finally emptied the castle and fortress library, and he set out on his journey home aboard the little town. Roland had assigned Petrov's family to be in charge of the Changji stronghold. As Roland approached the border town along the Redwater River, the scenery on both sides of the river had changed. On the opposite side of the town, many people were busy working. Judging by their attire, they were likely the serfs who had been sent ahead to the border town. On the side closer to the endless mountains, many makeshift wooden sheds had been built. Roland guessed that these were the homes of the serfs' families. These people had been bound to the land for generations, and even their children were born into serfdom. With little hope, most lived numbly, driven not by a genuine desire to work but by the whip and chains of their masters. Undoubtedly, slavery was an enemy of industrialized production and a system that had to be abolished. However, Roland had no intention of waving his hand and making all of them free citizens. Instead, he aimed to provide a pathway that would offer them a glimmer of hope for upward mobility and the chance to become free citizens. Closing into the shore of the border town, enjoying the last bit of salty ocean breeze, Roland took a deep breath. A very unpleasant odor mixed in the air. Wait for a second, holy shit, it's actually shit. Roland vomited into the ocean and planned the most important changes to the border town. Returning to his office, Roland barked an order while holding a blueprint in his hand. He wanted to construct toilets and bathrooms. Toilet? Carter pondered for a moment. He said that the villagers don't need such facilities, they can just relieve themselves outside. The same goes for the serfs, they usually dispose of their waste into the river, allowing the water to carry it away. Roland realized it would be difficult to explain to them, as this was the norm for the people in this world. Carl took a closer look at the blueprint and asked the purpose of the pool in the back. Roland didn't hesitate and said he needed to collect excrement. Both Barav and Carter were shocked to hear that His Highness wants to collect stools for farming. Imagine this, collecting the filthy dumps into buckets, spraying them onto the crops, then having them delivered onto the table where you put them into your mouth. Just thinking about it made the two vomit. The people in this different world have very little knowledge about fertilizers, and the vast majority of them believe that feces are a filthy substance that is only used to disgust others. They have never thought about its potential usefulness. Roland was well aware of the difficulties in using human and animal waste as fertilizer, which is far less convenient than chemical fertilizers. However, he had no clue about chemical industrialization, so he had to resort to using this purely natural organic fertilizer. As Roland drifted off into slumber, Nightingale materialized from the mist and gently tended to his bed, tucking in the sheets and covering his bare arm. She stood by his bedside, silently observing him for a fleeting moment, before tiptoeing across the creaky floorboards and disappearing into the shadows of her own room. "You're still awake?" Nightingale was taken aback to find Wendy seated by the bedside, engrossed in a book. "I'm afraid you'll do something wrong." Wendy glared at her, shooting her a sharp look. "His Highness is not a child. Is it necessary to watch over him until he falls asleep?" Roland had already sent people to spread rumors of a witch organization in the border town. Nightingale wanted to make sure that no one is there to harm Roland. Nightingale picked up a damp towel and casually wiped her face. She then proceeded to untie the red belt, wrist armor, and clasp of her outfit, before finally taking off the white clothes. This outfit was the prince's latest design. The combination of a white hooded overcoat and a white suit seemed incredibly conspicuous, but he thought it was perfect for an assassin. After carefully hanging up her clothes and smoothing out every crease, Nightingale's alluring curves were enveloped in a light veil, with not a trace of excess flesh visible on her toned abdomen and thighs. "Did you even listen to what I said to you last time?" Wendy sighed. "Veronica, we are witches." "I know, Wendy." Nightingale nodded. "We are witches." Nightingale scooped up some water in her hands, in the reflection. She sees herself, in her heart. She knew that His Highness the Prince will marry a witch, he said it himself, and he didn't lie. She jumped onto the bed, and lifted her slender legs together, flipping her body over to Wendy's side. Nightingale told Wendy about the priest's visit today, and the 2 pills priest Taylor brought in, wondering if Wendy still had any memories about the church. Hearing that the high priest of the church came to visit His Highness and expressed his willingness to support Roland in his bid for the throne. Wendy's tone started shaking, sounding nervously, asking what was Roland's response. Nightingale shook her head and reassured Wendy that Roland had denied the invite. Wendy let out a sigh of relief. Wendy closed her eyes and spoke slowly. She recalled the memories she had in the church. She lived in a monastery located in the old holy city. The place was surrounded by high walls, and there was no view other than the sky. Her daily activities were limited to the confines of the monastery. Living in the convent, the girls can be divided into 3 categories. Some, like Wendy, were born and raised here and have no knowledge of their origins. Others were taken in from the streets or orphanages by different churches and sent here, and some were sold to the church by their parents. They were taught how to read and write, etiquette, choir, and oratory. Girls of the oratory class are sent out of the monastery once they reach adulthood. During the first few years, the girls would often hear the girls from the choir and etiquette class screaming at night, and Wendy didn't understand what was happening. It wasn't until Wendy moved up to the choir class that she found out that the adults from the church would visit the dormitories at night and take away a few girls from their beds, only to return them in the morning. Sometimes, not all of them would come back. Nightingale had never heard Wendy talk in detail about her experiences in the monastery before, so this was the first time she had heard about these things. Nightingale tightened her lips. She certainly knew what Wendy's words meant. Seeing Wendy terrified by the horrible memories, Nightingale hugged her tightly and comforted her. Wendy then continued her story. This kind of thing happened once or twice every month, and when it was more frequent, it happened almost every other day. Then one day, Wendy was chosen, Farian. Wendy's teacher dragged her out of the room and took her to a hidden building in a corner of the courtyard. Farian threw her inside and told her to endure it, then locked the door behind her. The room was brightly lit, and on the wall was another girl from her class that was being tortured by 5 men. It was clear that these men have done very disturbing things to the girl on the wall. Wendy was visibly scared, her body shaking uncontrollably. She had her back against the wall, watching the 5 men walking towards her. Wendy slammed the door and screamed for help, but no one answered her calls. One of the men grabbed Wendy's hair and slammed her onto the wall, grabbing her neck, and just as he is about to harm Wendy, Wendy heard a loud crunch behind her. The girl suddenly broke free from her shackles and grabbed the neck of the person closest to her, killing him like twisting off a chicken's neck. The other man quickly surrounded her, but it was no use. Even with God punishment stones, she killed them one by one. One of them had his limbs torn apart by her. Before he died, his last words were "super awakening." The guards were drawn by the noise and scream, and rushed into the room. Alongside was Farian. One of the guards drew his sword and swung at the girl. The church's standard armor was like paper in front of her, as she had already pierced through the chest with her bare hands. She then leaped into the air and killed the other guard, then struck a sword into Farian's body. The room was filled with gore and blood. As reinforcement arrived, the girl picked up the weapon of the fallen guards. She also cleaved another guard in half, the blade broken into several pieces. All of the guards were chasing after the girl, and Wendy managed to escape during the chaotic scenes. Wendy then spent the next 2 years homeless, but during a winter, she awakened and became a witch. She heard that the church was burnt down to cover up the incident, and the girl that saved her was not sure of her whereabouts. Nightingale sighed deeply and embraced Wendy. "Now you have us. Sleep, Wendy." Wiping off the tear on Wendy, and hugged her tightly onto her chest.